At 5:42 a.m., the neighborhood was still half asleep when Haji Abdul Qadir stepped out of his small two-story house for what should have been another ordinary morning walk. The air carried that faint chill common before sunrise in Pakistani suburbs, and the streetlights were just beginning to flicker out. For years, this routine had been as reliable as the call to prayer. Qadir, walking with a slow, steady rhythm, greeting the milkman, the newspaper boy, and anyone else awake at that hour. To his neighbors, he was the kind of elder people trusted instantly. To his family, he was the backbone, quiet, disciplined, predictable, in all the ways that made people feel safe. Nothing dramatic ever happened around him. Nothing ever changed. That's why the morning of his disappearance felt so impossible to understand. Everything up to the moment he left was normal. He woke before dawn, offered Fajr prayer, drank a glass of lukewarm water, and tied the same lightweight shawl around his shoulders. His wife remembered hearing the click of the gate as he stepped outside. She didn't even get out of bed. Why would she? He always returned before 7 a.m., like clockwork, but by 7:05, when he still hadn't come back, she felt the first sting of worry. It wasn't panic, not yet, just a quiet sense that something was off. She brewed tea to keep herself occupied. By 7:20, she checked the gate twice. By 7:40, she finally woke their eldest son, telling him something wasn't right. He brushed it off at first, assuming his father had stopped to chat with someone. But when the minutes turned into nearly an hour, unease hardened into urgency. They stepped outside and began calling his name down the empty street. Neighbors were surprised when the family began knocking on doors asking if anyone had seen him. Everyone said the same thing they had seen Haji Qadir earlier, walking his usual route. He passed the corner bakery, nodded to the fruit vendor setting up his stall, and exchanged a quick smile with a retired postman who often sat outside at dawn. But every sighting stopped at the same intersection, an old banyan tree near a small, unused plot of land. Past that point, no one had seen him. It made no sense. There were only two turns he could have taken, and both led to residential streets that people used daily. Someone should have spotted him. Someone always did. By 9 a.m., the family had searched the entire routine path 3 times. There was no sign of him, no collapsed figure by the road, no discarded shawl, no clue at all. They finally went to the local police station, their voices trembling as they explained what had happened. But in the early hours of a typical weekday, the police were calm, almost dismissive. Older men wandered off sometimes, they explained. Maybe he felt dizzy and sat somewhere to rest. Maybe he visited a friend. Maybe his phone died. Maybe he would walk through the door any minute now with a sheepish smile. The family insisted this wasn't like him. He never changed his route, never missed his morning tea, never disappeared without telling someone. But the officers filled out the missing person form at a painfully slow pace, as though this was just another routine report that would resolve itself by evening. By noon, the family was searching open plots, abandoned structures, and empty lots with a rising sense of dread. The sun was high, the streets were louder, and the neighborhood had fully woken up, but no one had anything new to say. Every conversation ended with the same helpless phrase, "He was at the intersection, and then he wasn't." As the day stretched on, that intersection became the center of everything. People stood there, pointing, speculating, walking the possible routes again and again. The banyan tree's massive roots twisted across the ground like old scars, and the quiet plot beside it felt strangely isolated for a place right in the middle of a residential area. Some neighbors whispered that stray dogs were often seen digging there. Others said they had heard unusual noises the night before. But none of it was solid enough to matter. There was still no physical trace of him. By the time evening arrived, exhaustion and fear had settled heavily on the family. They gathered in the living room as the sky darkened outside, replaying every detail of his last morning. His wife remembered nothing unusual, no worry on his face, no strange phone calls, no arguments. His son remembered hearing the sound of his footsteps in the corridor before dawn. Everything seemed painfully normal. The police finally returned around sunset, organizing a small search team. Flashlights swept through alleys, empty plots, and neighboring streets. Dogs barked in the distance. Residents peeked out from behind windows, drawn by the sight of uniforms. By midnight, the officers admitted something no one wanted to hear. There were no leads, no clues, no signs of foul play, no signs of a medical emergency, nothing. It was as if the earth had opened up and swallowed him whole. That first night was a blur of fear and confusion. His wife sat awake with a prayer bead in her hand, refusing to sleep. His children scrolled endlessly through his recent messages, hoping for something, anything. His neighbors stayed outside longer than usual, whispering theories, wondering how a man could simply disappear in a place where everyone knew everyone. A neighborhood that once felt small and safe now felt vast and threatening. As the clock passed 24 hours, something shifted. What began as confusion had grown into a chilling realization. This disappearance made no logical sense. He hadn't wandered off. He hadn't lost his way. He hadn't collapsed unnoticed. He was gone, and whatever happened had happened fast enough, quiet enough, and clean enough that an entire community somehow missed it. The family returned to the intersection one last time before sunrise the next day. Streetlights hummed softly overhead. The same fruit vendor set up his stall. The same bakery owner swept the sidewalk. Life looked exactly the same as it had the morning before, except for the one person who should have been walking towards them, shawl draped around his shoulders, greeting them with a tired but warm smile. But he wasn't there, and as the first shadow of dawn spread across the road, one truth settled deeply into every heart standing there. Whatever happened at that intersection was not ordinary. Someone, somewhere, knew more than they were saying. Something had interrupted his path, something so unexpected and so silent that it left no trace behind. It was the kind of disappearance that didn't just break routine, it broke the very sense of safety the neighborhood had built over decades. And as the family stood there trying to understand how a man could vanish without a sound, they had no idea that this quiet, unremarkable corner would dominate their lives for the next 12 years, until a clue finally emerged that changed everything. The second morning began with a sharp, unspoken urgency hanging over the neighborhood. By dawn, word of Haji Abdul Qadir's disappearance had spread far beyond the immediate streets, pulling people from their homes with a mixture of concern and shock. Older men who had walked beside him for years gathered quietly near the banyan tree, staring down each road as if expecting him to appear. Others stood with folded arms, whispering theories that made no sense even to them. This was not a man who wandered. This was not a neighborhood where strangers blended in unnoticed. And yet, somehow, he was simply gone. By 8 a.m., police shifted from passive reassurance to active involvement. Officers marked areas on printed maps, dividing the surrounding blocks into grids. Their plan was straightforward: sweep every open field, every empty plot, every accessible rooftop, every drain, every corner where a person could collapse, hide, or be hidden. It was the kind of search that usually produced answers, even if those answers were painful. But as the hours unfolded, something unnerving emerged. Every grid turned up clean, as if no human being had passed through them in days. The first official search zone was the open plot beside the banyan tree, the last place anyone had seen him. Police combed through the uneven ground, checking behind stacked bricks, beneath scrap iron sheets, and around the skeletal frame of an unfinished wall. Men pushed long sticks through tall weeds, expecting at any moment to feel contact, cloth, skin, anything. But the earth remained silent. There was no disturbance in the dirt, no possessions, no drag marks, no signs of a struggle. The space looked untouched. Forensic dogs were brought in next, their handlers walking them slowly across the ground. At first, the dogs seemed alert, picking up faint trace scents near the intersection. But halfway through the search, the dogs stalled, circled in confusion, and then wandered aimlessly. The scent trail simply ended in the middle of an open street, with nothing ahead and nothing behind. It was an outcome the handlers rarely saw. Scent trails usually faded gradually, not snapped abruptly as if someone had been lifted out of the environment entirely. Police officers then moved door to door, knocking on homes along the route, asking every resident to recount the morning in exact detail. Dozens of people claimed they saw him earlier, but no one saw him afterward. One shopkeeper remembered hearing a stray dog barking unusually around the time Qadir disappeared, but he couldn't say from which direction. Another homeowner recalled seeing a white Suzuki van parked near the intersection, but she wasn't sure if it was that morning or the one before. Every lead fell apart the moment officers tried to verify it. CCTV should have been the answer. The neighborhood wasn't heavily monitored, but there were still cameras, shop cameras, private home units, small corner store systems. Officers collected footage from every direction leading into and out of the intersection. The family waited anxiously while police played the recordings frame by frame. They watched blurry silhouettes walking, bicycles passing, school vans moving, shadows shifting with the rising Sunday, but not a single camera captured Kadir after he crossed that junction. It was as if he stepped through a gap in reality that no lens could reach. While police worked, the family organized their own parallel search. Cousins, nephews, neighbors, and friends volunteered in small teams. They formed lines, walking shoulder to shoulder through open fields. They checked abandoned houses where addicts occasionally gathered. They examined rooftops and construction sites. They even ventured into areas they had no reason to suspect: secluded shrines, underpasses, old railway tracks, anywhere someone vulnerable might have wandered. But by sunset, every team returned with the same shaken expression and the same empty hands. Then, late on the second day, a discovery shattered whatever faint hope remained. A group of volunteers searching near a drainage ditch noticed a familiar shape resting on a patch of dry soil. When they picked it up, they froze. It was his mobile phone. The device was intact, without cracks or scuff marks. It wasn't buried or thrown. It was simply placed, as if someone had set it down gently, almost respectfully. When the police arrived, they confirmed the phone had been powered off, not out of battery, but manually switched off. That detail hit everyone hard. Kadir never turned off his phone. He barely used it except to answer calls from his family. The officer who examined the spot noted something else. There were no footprints around the phone. The soil should have shown impressions either from Kadir or whoever placed it there. But the area around the phone remained undisturbed, almost suspiciously so. It looked staged, deliberate. The family's first reaction was disbelief, followed quickly by rising fear. If the phone was placed, not dropped, then someone else had touched it. Someone else had been involved in whatever happened to him. And that possibility widened the investigation into darker territory. Police began considering foul play: abduction, opportunistic robbery, a targeted kidnapping. But each theory cracked under scrutiny. If it was robbery, why were his wallet, watch, and prayer beads also missing without appearing anywhere else? If it was kidnapping, why had no one reported seeing a struggle? Why had no ransom call come? Why choose an elderly man with no known enemies or significant wealth? And if he had been forcibly taken, how had no camera, no resident, and not even the dogs detected a hint of it? One officer suggested a medical emergency, proposing that disorientation or sudden memory loss had led him to wander into less obvious areas, but the family immediately dismissed it. He had no history of dementia, no chronic illness, and his walk had always been calm and controlled. And even if he had become disoriented, someone would have seen him. The streets were never empty at that hour. 2 days passed. Then 3. The search efforts expanded further from the neighborhood, stretching into adjacent towns. Police printed flyers with his photograph, an older man with a weathered face, trimmed beard, and soft eyes, and distributed them at bus stops, markets, and mosques. Volunteers taped posters to every electric pole in a 5-kilometer radius. Taxi and rickshaw drivers were briefed on the case. But no one came forward with credible information. By the 5th day, exhaustion seeped into the search. People who had once been certain he would be found now spoke in quieter tones, glancing at the road with a sense of growing dread. But the family continued fighting. They organized fresh volunteers each morning, returning to the same areas again and again, as if they had missed something small, something crucial, something waiting to be found on the 10th or 20th pass. One evening, during a coordinated sweep of a nearby graveyard, a volunteer paused near a freshly dug grave. For a moment, he felt certain he had found something important, but when officers inspected it, they confirmed it had been dug earlier for a scheduled burial. Each incident like that chipped away at the emotional endurance of everyone involved. By the end of the first week, the disappearance no longer felt like a simple missing person case. It felt orchestrated. It felt intentional. It felt wrong. Police revisited the phone as their only tangible clue. Forensics couldn't retrieve fingerprints. It had been handled by too many people by the time it was turned in. The call logs revealed nothing unusual. The last recorded activity was a routine message from a neighbor asking about a local charity meeting, opened the night before he vanished. No incoming calls after 5 a.m., no outgoing attempts during his walk. But there was one strange detail. The phone had been powered off approximately 45 minutes after he left his home. That timing narrowed the window of disappearance. It also confirmed that someone had shut it down intentionally, whether Kadir or someone else, no one knew. But the timing didn't match anything logical. If he had collapsed or felt dizzy, he wouldn't turn off his phone. If he had wanted to leave voluntarily, he wouldn't walk the same route he always did. The family began arguing among themselves privately, each trying to explain the inexplicable. Some believed he had been lured or forced into a vehicle. Others suspected someone in the neighborhood knew more than they were admitting. His eldest son grew convinced it was a targeted act. Someone had watched him long enough to know his routine, chosen the exact moment the streets were quietest, and moved with enough precision to avoid every camera and witness. The police didn't rule out any possibility, but the absence of evidence became its own barrier. No footprints, no clothing, no eyewitnesses, no sounds of distress, no ransom, no message, nothing. It was as though the case rejected progress, as if every lead dissolved the moment it was touched. By the 10th day, officers openly admitted the case was unusual, not unsolvable, not cold, just difficult in ways that defied familiarity. They shifted their patrols to nighttime searches, hoping cooler hours might yield something overlooked during the day. Volunteers walked along irrigation canals with long poles, probing the depths. Others searched old wells sealed with rusty lids. The desperation grew quieter but heavier. 2 weeks passed. The posters fluttered in the wind, sun faded. The volunteers thinned. Neighbors stopped gathering outside as often. The story remained alive, but its energy dimmed beneath exhaustion and fear. The police continued their work, but each day they returned with the same solemn expression, no new information. And slowly, something darker settled over the neighborhood. The realization that a man had vanished in broad daylight from a place he knew intimately, surrounded by people who cared for him, and none of the systems designed to find missing people, neighbors, volunteers, police, cameras, trained dogs had been able to trace even a single step beyond that intersection. It felt impossible. And yet, there it was. A disappearance that should have been solved easily had now grown into a mystery large enough to swallow logic itself. And underneath everything, the posters, the searches, the theories, one question lingered with a weight that seemed to thicken the air. If this disappearance was so clean, then maybe it wasn't meant to be found at all. But 12 years later, long after hope had hardened into silence, a clue would finally surface in a place no one thought to look, pulling the entire case back into the light and revealing what truly happened on that quiet morning walk. For days, the search for Haji Kadir had moved through the same familiar spaces, the street where he took his morning walks, the small shops where he greeted people by name, the few blocks he rarely ventured beyond. But when nothing surfaced from the obvious, investigators slowly turned their attention away from the neighborhood and toward the man himself. They realized that if answers weren't out there, they might be buried somewhere inside the life he left behind. The shift happened quietly. One officer began combing through his old documents. Another started interviewing distant family members, and soon the focus of the investigation was no longer where he went, but who he actually was. To most people, Haji Kadir had appeared simple. A retired laborer who lived a quiet routine, prayed on time, kept to himself, and adored his grandchildren. But beneath that calm surface, the police found threads thin, subtle, but undeniably present, pointing to a past more tangled than anyone expected. The first hint came from his financial records. Investigators discovered small but persistent debts stretching back several years. Nothing dramatic, not enough to raise alarms, but enough to make them pause. These weren't the kinds of debts a careless man collected. They were the kinds that accumulate quietly when someone tries to stay afloat without letting the world know they're struggling. Old colleagues painted a mixed picture. A man respected by many, but one who wasn't afraid of arguments when he believed he was right. He had left 2 jobs abruptly, each following disputes that seemed petty on the surface but held undertones of long-standing tension. When asked about them, his family only shrugged. They said it had been too long ago, that he never brought it up. But when the police reached out to his extended relatives in his native village, the tone of the story changed. A cousin, older, stubborn, unfiltered, mentioned a land issue from decades back, an inheritance that had been divided unfairly, according to him, a bitter disagreement that had never been fully resolved. The cousin insisted it was nothing, just the kind of argument families have all the time. Yet the way he spoke about it suggested something else lingering beneath the casual words. Police wondered whether old wounds had resurfaced, whether someone in that quiet village still carried resentment. Then came the second layer of complexity. Kadir had owned a small property back in the village, a piece of land mostly forgotten. On paper, it was still in his name, but neighbors there claimed he hadn't visited in years, until, strangely, a week before he disappeared. He had shown up alone, stayed for barely an hour, and left without explaining why. The timing was too close to ignore. Investigators tried to retrace his steps, but no one seemed to know why he came, what he looked for, or whether he met someone privately. This discovery made the earlier clues feel heavier. The debts, the job disputes, the family tensions, the property visit. It all formed a picture that didn't align with the man his family described. A man who stuck to routines and rarely traveled anywhere without a reason. Still, nothing directly pointed to danger. That changed when they found out about the phone call. According to phone records, Kadir received a call the night before he vanished. A number he had never contacted before. The call lasted only 2 minutes. Suspiciously, the number was shut off the next morning and never turned on again. When police asked the family about it, no one knew anything. No one had heard the phone ring. No one remembered him stepping aside to talk. But the grandson, the same one who had spent the most time with him, hesitated before answering. He admitted, quietly and with some discomfort, that his grandfather had seemed different for weeks. It wasn't dramatic or alarming. It was subtle, small things he only understood in hindsight. He said Kadir would often stand on the balcony at night, not to enjoy the breeze or look at the sky, but to stare down the street as if expecting someone. Sometimes he would sit up late, long after everyone else had gone to bed, simply listening, watching, thinking. The grandson had brushed it off as old age, maybe insomnia, maybe worry about bills or family matters. But now it felt like something else. Like a man waiting for something or someone. Police pressed on, digging deeper into the final days before the disappearance. That was when they uncovered the most confusing detail yet. A significant sum of money had recently been withdrawn from his account, more than he had ever taken out at one time. His family had no idea about it. The envelope of cash he always kept in his drawer was empty, but there were no signs of theft. His room was undisturbed, his belongings untouched. Nothing appeared forced. It was as if he withdrew the money for a purpose, placed it somewhere, and took whatever he needed with him that morning. But if that was true, then what was he planning? Detectives considered every angle. Perhaps he was paying someone back. Perhaps he was being blackmailed. Maybe he owed someone money tied to his old disputes. Or maybe, and this was the theory that bothered everyone most, he had planned to leave on his own. But if he intended to run, why leave without clothes? Without identification? Without saying anything to the family he loved? His past provided potential motives, but nothing that solidified into a clear threat. Every thread they followed seemed promising at first, only to unravel into uncertainty. A debt that looked serious turned out to be old and resolved. A work dispute was nothing more than heated words exchanged years ago. The land issue, while bitter, had never escalated beyond frustration, and the cousin, though stubborn, had no history of violence. Still, the pattern was undeniable. There were inconsistencies everywhere. A drive to the village, the late-night balcony watching, the unexplained phone call, the missing money. A man described as predictable suddenly displaying unpredictable behavior, and yet none of it fit together in a way that made sense. The grandson added another detail, one that investigators initially dismissed. He said his grandfather had been quieter than usual, distracted during meals, sometimes pausing mid-sentence as if something else occupied his mind. There were moments when he seemed restless, pacing the room without any real reason, then moments when he appeared deeply sad, staring at old photographs for long stretches. The family had noticed, but they assumed it was just age or memories catching up to him. No one imagined it could be connected to something darker. The more police examined his life, the more they realized how little they truly understood him. On the surface, everything was ordinary, but underneath there were cracks, subtle, almost invisible, hinting that he may have been carrying worries, secrets, or fears too heavy to share. Investigators tried to reconstruct the timeline of the night before his disappearance, hoping to find patterns in the noise, but the accounts were frustratingly vague. Family members remembered him being quiet, but not unusually so. He went to bed around his usual time, though the grandson believed he heard movement later, soft footsteps, a door creaking open briefly, then closing again. It could have been the wind, it could have been nothing. But in cases like this, nothing often becomes the question that won't go away. Every lead pointed toward something, but every conclusion dissolved before they reached it. The withdrawn money hinted at a plan, but the lack of preparation suggested the opposite. The balcony watching implied fear, but the calm routine the next morning contradicted it. The phone call suggested contact, but the disconnected number erased any trail. Investigators found themselves circling the same questions over and over. Was Kadir hiding something from his family? Was someone watching him, threatening him, pressuring him? Or was he involved in something quietly, something he believed he could manage until it spiraled beyond control? The police were haunted by one fact above all: the morning he disappeared was entirely normal. Nothing in his behavior, clothing, or movements suggested urgency or danger. He didn't seem like a man going to meet someone. He didn't seem scared. He didn't even seem hurried. He simply left for a walk and never returned. That contradiction became the center of the case. If he was troubled, why did he hide it so well? If he wasn't troubled, why all the signs of secrecy? And if someone wanted to hurt him, why were there no signs of struggle, threats, or warnings? The deeper the investigators dug, the more elusive the truth became. His life wasn't as simple as it had seemed, but it wasn't complicated enough to justify a disappearance either. It was as though he existed in a space between two realities, one where he was an ordinary grandfather with a predictable routine, and another where he carried secrets no one knew how to interpret. Every lead eventually snapped. Every clue led to silence. And every question pushed investigators into the same unsettling possibility. What if Kadir's disappearance wasn't an accident or a sudden event, but a process? Something that had been building slowly, quietly, beneath the surface of a life his family thought they understood. A process he either walked into willingly or was being pulled toward without knowing it. And as the threads of his past began to tangle instead of straighten, a chilling idea settled in. Whatever happened to him might have been planned long before he stepped out for that morning walk. Planned by someone else, or just as disturbingly planned by him. The investigation was no longer about where he went. It had become a question of who he really was, and what he had been preparing for in the dark, quiet corners of his final weeks. 12 years is a long time to wait for answers, long enough for seasons to repeat themselves, for memories to soften around the edges, for children to grow into adults who can barely remember the sound of a missing man's voice. But for Haji Kadir's family, time did not move in a straight line. It circled the same morning again and again, the morning he walked out of his home and never returned. Every year only added weight to the silence, stretching it into something heavy enough to reshape the lives of everyone who loved him. In the early months after his disappearance, the house was always full. Relatives, neighbors, volunteers, police officers, all moving through the rooms, offering help, theories, condolences. Some stayed for hours, others for days. People prayed loudly, insisting he would return. People whispered quietly, wondering if he was already gone. The family held on tightly to whatever hope they could find, believing each new knock on the door might bring news. But hope is not built to last forever without evidence to support it. After the first year, the crowds thinned. After the second, only close relatives still visited regularly. By the third, most neighbors had stopped bringing food and stopped asking questions. The house settled into a quiet routine of grief, the kind that grows not from what is known, but from what can't be proven. Anniversaries became the heaviest days. Every year, at the same time he left for his walk, the family gathered near the gate. At first, they prayed together. Later, they stood in silence. Eventually, they stopped gathering altogether, because standing in the same place without answers became too painful. Each anniversary marked not only the passing of another year, but the breaking of another peace within the family. Suspicion also grew quietly, appearing in conversations the way shadows appear before sunset, slowly at first, then suddenly everywhere. Relatives began to accuse one another without using actual words. A cousin questioned why the family hadn't searched the village longer. A brother wondered why Kadir had been acting strangely only around certain people. A neighbor hinted that someone inside the family must know more than they were saying. What began as shared devastation slowly twisted into mutual distrust. Police investigators rotated through the case in waves. Each new officer arrived with fresh determination, convinced they would be the one to see something everyone else had missed. They reopened files, re-interviewed relatives, re-examined the route he walked that morning. They retraced old leads, traveled to the village again, and questioned every person who had even briefly crossed paths with him. And every time, the momentum collapsed under the same harsh reality. There was no body, no crime scene, no suspects, no evidence, except hints too thin to build on. One investigator tried to reconstruct the timeline using the data from CCTV cameras mounted on nearby streets. The recording showed Kadir walking past the first camera at 6:42 a.m. He was steady, calm, carrying nothing in his hands. The next camera was just 400 meters away. He should have appeared on it within 2 minutes, but he didn't. The footage simply skipped from an empty street to more empty street. No car approaching him, no person following behind him, no sign of anything unusual. The gap between those two cameras became the heart of the mystery. People in the neighborhood began calling it the blind spot. Over the years, the case slowly transformed from an investigation into a local legend, a whispered story about the man who vanished between two CCTV cameras. Despite the growing numbness, the case did not remain still. Every few years, something happened, something small, unnerving, and impossible to ignore that pulled the family back into the storm. The first incident occurred 3 years after the disappearance. A postcard arrived at the family's house with no return address and no name. On the front was a picture of a mountain range. On the back, in shaky handwriting, were 3 words: "He walked too far." No other message, no explanation. Police traced the postmark to a town hundreds of kilometers away, but the specific sender remained unidentifiable. Some officers believed it was a cruel prank by someone who had read about the case. Others suspected it was a clue, a deliberate message from someone who knew something. The family kept the postcard locked in a drawer. They couldn't forget it, but they couldn't interpret it either. 2 years later, a man claimed he saw someone resembling Kadir in a remote village near the river. He described him as older, thinner, and moving with a slow, cautious gait. The sighting spread through the family like electricity. His daughter clung to the idea that he might still be alive somewhere, lost or hurt or held by someone. Police traveled to the village, questioned dozens of people, compared old photographs, but the man who was seen was never found again. Villagers insisted he had moved on the next day. Some said he lived under a nearby bridge. Others swore he was just a traveler passing through. None of it held steady under scrutiny. The sighting quietly dissolved into another unanswered question. Then there was the burnt clothing. It was discovered by a shepherd 5 years after the disappearance. A half-charred piece of fabric caught in the branches of a thorny bush deep in an uninhabited area. The shepherd thought little of it until he recognized the color a muted brown, the same shade Kadir had been wearing the morning he vanished. Police collected the piece, sent it for testing, and compared it to photographs. The pattern looked similar, but there was no definitive way to confirm it belonged to him. Some officers believed it was unrelated, just old cloth blown off a trash pile. Others felt certain it was connected. The location was isolated, far from the routes he would normally walk, raising more questions than answers. Each incident brought the family back to the edge of hope before pushing them back into despair. And with every disappointment, the emotional fractures grew deeper. His daughter, who had once been strong enough to speak to the media and organize search parties, withdrew into herself. She rarely entered his room, and when she did, it was only to open the windows for a moment before closing them again. She refused to change the bedsheets on his bed. They remained exactly as they were the night before he disappeared, the folds, the creases, even the slight indentation where he used to rest. It wasn't a shrine. It was her way of holding on to the last proof that he had existed inside that house. She said that if she changed anything, it would feel like accepting that he wasn't coming back. His wife carried the silence differently. She kept his sandals near the doorway, right where he had placed them every night. Whenever someone suggested putting them away to make space, she shook her head. She said the house would feel wrong without them. She cleaned them, dusted them, kept them in perfect condition. On some nights, she left the front light on longer than necessary, as if expecting to hear the familiar rhythm of his footsteps returning. Her grief was quieter but no less consuming. She stopped smiling in photographs. She stopped attending family gatherings. She stopped speaking about him in the past tense. As the years passed, suspicion continued simmering. Two brothers who had once shared a close bond stopped speaking entirely after one accused the other of withholding information from investigators. A cousin who had been questioned multiple times avoided family functions to escape the stares. Even the grandson, who had grown into a young adult, carried a weight of guilt for not understanding the signs he had noticed before the disappearance. He replayed old memories, searching for moments he might have missed, patterns he could not have known to look for at the time. The police, too, struggled with the case. Every few years, a new investigator took over. Some treated it as a challenge, others saw it as a burden. Each reopened the files, revisited old theories, walked the route again. Each ended with the same conclusion written in different words. No evidence of abduction, no proof of voluntary disappearance, no confirmed sightings, no leads that held. They could not prove he was alive. They could not prove he was dead. The case existed in a vacuum, suspended between two impossible possibilities. 12 years later, the disappearance of Haji Qadir had become something else, not an active case, not a closed one, but an unfinished story spreading quietly across the town. School children whispered it to each other. Shopkeepers repeated it to new customers. Elders told it during gatherings, describing him as the man who vanished without walking into danger and without walking out of it. It became a reminder that even the safest routines can hide silent fractures, and even the most ordinary people can leave behind mysteries that refuse to fade. Yet, inside the family home, the tragedy did not feel like a story. It felt like a constant, like weather that never changed. There were days when the sorrow softened into resignation, and days when it rose sharply, triggered by a scent, a memory, or a face in the street that resembled him from a distance. But on the 12th anniversary, something shifted. Not in the house, not in the neighborhood, but somewhere unexpected, the kind of shift that begins quietly, unnoticed, the way storms begin far from the shore long before the first cloud appears. An officer reviewing old files stumbled upon a detail so small it had been dismissed 12 years earlier, a detail that, under new technology and with new context, suddenly seemed impossible to ignore. It wasn't a solution, not yet, but it wasn't a dead end either. For the first time in more than a decade, the silence surrounding the case did not feel final. It felt like it was about to break. 12 years had passed with little more than shadows and whispers left behind, yet the story of Haji Abdul Qadir's disappearance was far from over. The quiet streets of the neighborhood had largely forgotten the rhythm of his disciplined morning walks. Shops opened and closed, children grew into adults, and neighbors replaced their recollections of that fateful day with routine life. But fate has a way of unearthing secrets long buried, and one ordinary municipal repair project would shatter 12 years of silence. Workers had been digging near a drainage line along the very path Qadir had once taken daily. It was meant to be a simple maintenance operation, routine and forgettable. The first hour passed without incident, shovels scraping against old soil and clay. Then, one of the laborers struck something metallic, dull and resistant. At first, they thought it was discarded construction debris. As they unearthed it, a glint of rust emerged, a small, corroded key, tightly wrapped in brittle, deteriorating plastic. Beside it lay a leather pouch, also buried beneath years of dirt and grit. Its surface was scuffed and weathered, but inside was something even more intriguing: a torn photograph. The image was old, faded at the edges, but unmistakable. Kadir, decades younger, stood alongside two men whose faces were unfamiliar to anyone alive today. They smiled for the camera, casual, unassuming, as if caught in a moment entirely mundane. But now, 12 years later, the photograph carried an ominous weight, hinting at connections and histories no one had previously considered. It was as though the past had waited for the precise moment to re-emerge, demanding attention. Police were called immediately. The discovery of the key and pouch was not just coincidental, it was a clue that had slept underground, untouched and unnoticed, waiting for someone to stumble upon it. The case reopened with a renewed intensity, the investigators' minds running through every scenario that could connect the buried objects to Kadir's disappearance. The key itself bore distinctive wear marks, and when cross-referenced against municipal and private records, it matched a storage locker rented anonymously in 2009, 2 full years before Kadir vanished. The timing was uncanny, a prelude that suggested forethought, planning, or at least a careful preparation that had remained invisible for over a decade. Inside the storage locker, the metal box was exactly as one would imagine something untouched for years. Coated with layers of dust, its edges oxidized, and the lock itself stubbornly resistant after so long. When investigators pried it open, they found a collection of objects that would shift the narrative of the entire case. There were old land transfer papers, meticulously organized, documenting property inherited by Kadir over decades. Alongside them were letters, written with care but never sent, their contents detailing growing unease and cautious suspicion toward certain relatives. And at the center of it all was a diary, fragile and yellowed, its pages filled with handwriting that revealed the inner fears of a man who had been quietly cornered by circumstances, plotting, and hidden pressures. The diary entries were meticulous, almost obsessive, chronicling meetings, phone calls, and incidents that at the time seemed minor. Kadir described subtle threats from a relative, veiled comments about signing over property, and unexplained visits to his home, where questions were asked that made him increasingly uneasy. The language was deliberate, cautious, a man aware of the stakes, and unwilling to trust anyone outside a select circle. Every entry painted the picture of a life lived quietly, yet under surveillance from within the family itself. He feared coercion, he feared betrayal, and he feared that any wrong move might leave him vulnerable. The letters complemented the diary, though they were never sent. Each was carefully addressed to friends, neighbors, or distant relatives, but they remained folded and stacked in the box, a testament to his hesitancy. Some letters outlined concerns about inheritance disputes. Others recounted minor arguments that now seemed to foreshadow something far more serious. One particularly chilling note read, in part, that he believed someone was planning to force him to relinquish his ancestral property, though he did not know who or how. The tone was calm on the surface but carried the tremor of underlying fear, a subtle desperation only visible in hindsight. Investigators pieced together what the evidence suggested. If Kadir had been aware of a looming threat, his disappearance could not be explained solely by chance or random accident. The careful burial of the key and pouch indicated deliberate concealment, but whether it was by Kadir himself or by someone else remained uncertain. Did he place it there to protect vital information in the event something happened to him? Or had a third party hidden these objects intentionally, knowing that the passage of time might eventually expose their secrets? Every scenario was plausible, each more disturbing than the last. The storage locker and its contents reframed the investigation entirely. What had once seemed like a routine disappearance was now clearly entangled in calculated decisions, secret anxieties, and potential threats from people he trusted most. The narrative of a man simply wandering off in the early morning hours shifted toward one of premeditation, fear, and concealed conflict. The public, once resigned to thinking Kadir had vanished inexplicably, now saw the outlines of a story that had been hidden just beneath the surface. Even the photograph in the pouch raised questions that would haunt investigators. Who were the two men standing next to a younger Kadir? Were they allies, adversaries, or merely acquaintances whose role had remained invisible until now? Attempts to identify them through archives, census records, and local interviews produced no definitive answers. Some suggested they could be business partners or friends from his village. Others feared the photograph might depict people with intent to manipulate or intimidate him years before he disappeared. Regardless, the image's rediscovery reopened a trail that had long gone cold, hinting at connections, long forgotten but suddenly urgent. The family, upon learning of the discovery, experienced a mix of relief, horror, and disbelief. The diary and letters provided answers that had eluded them for over a decade, yet the knowledge came with a weight. Kadir had feared for his life before his disappearance. He had acted with caution, planning for contingencies, and in doing so, had left a trail that only the passage of time could expose. There was sorrow in realizing that he had carried this burden alone, and anger at the possibility that someone within his circle may have intended harm. For the children and grandchildren, it was as if a hidden chapter of his life had finally emerged, one that revealed a man far more aware of danger than they had ever known. Investigators focused on the implications of the land papers and letters. The documentation suggested a motive: inheritance and property. Whether Kadir had vanished voluntarily to protect himself or had been intercepted by someone who knew his concerns was now the central question. Experts in criminal psychology noted that the level of foresight and caution reflected in the diary was consistent with someone who anticipated direct interference, perhaps even abduction, though nothing in the past 12 years could confirm this definitively. The key, the pouch, and the locker were tangible evidence of preparation, yet they also underscored the fragility of a life lived under hidden threat. Each new discovery prompted careful forensic and historical analysis. The plastic wrapping around the key, deteriorated but deliberate, suggested it had been hidden with intention, not discarded carelessly. The pouch's burial in earth along a route Kadir had walked daily indicated detailed knowledge of his movements. Whoever buried it, whether he himself or another party, understood patterns, routes, and timelines. The storage locker's anonymous rental 2 years prior added another layer, implying advanced planning long before the disappearance, either as a contingency or as a deliberate setup. The tone of the investigation shifted from passive to active. For 12 years, the disappearance had felt like a frozen moment, a story locked in time. The resurfacing of these clues injected momentum back into the case. Police interviewed relatives anew, comparing old suspicions against the tangible evidence found in the locker. Analysts cross-referenced diary entries with property disputes, long-forgotten conversations, and village records. Each new connection added both clarity and complexity, revealing the depth of pre-existing tension surrounding Kadir's final days. The ultimate question loomed: did Haji Abdul Kadir walk away to protect himself, vanishing deliberately into obscurity to prevent coercion? Or was his disappearance the result of forces acting against him, silencing a man who had taken precautions he hoped would safeguard his family's inheritance? The objects found that day did not provide definitive answers, but they reframed the entire narrative. What had once been an unexplainable disappearance was now a story of calculation, fear, and foresight. A man caught between the predictable rhythms of daily life and the hidden dangers that lay in waiting. As the sun set over the quiet street where the key and pouch had lain hidden for 12 years, there was a sense that the story was finally beginning to breathe again. The family, the investigators, and the neighborhood felt the weight of possibility that the past had left clues precisely for this moment, that answers were no longer entirely unreachable. And while the ultimate resolution, whether voluntary or forced, remained out of reach, the discovery ensured that Haji Kadir's disappearance would never be seen as a simple mystery again. Every step, every document, every handwritten line had transformed 12 years of silence into a trail that could now be followed, questioned, and understood. For the first time in more than a decade, the disappearance did not feel like a closed book. It felt like a story reawakening, its next chapter waiting to be written by the hands of those willing to see the hidden truths buried beneath years of absence. And in that awakening, hope, fear, and revelation coexisted, the very emotions that had defined Haji Kadir's final walk, now poised to reshape the case that had haunted so many for 12 long years. The discovery of the key, the photograph, and the hidden diary had reopened a case that had lain dormant for more than a decade. Investigators pored over every detail, retracing footsteps that had once seemed hopelessly cold. The photograph of Kadir with the two unknown men became central to the renewed investigation. Police worked tirelessly to identify them. One, they learned, had died years earlier in a distant city, leaving no further trace. The other had relocated abroad, living a life separated from the very streets where Kadir had vanished. Both identities were fragments of a puzzle that had remained unsolved for 12 years, yet their connection to Kadir was undeniable. The diary offered a crucial clue, a reference to a meeting scheduled for the morning he disappeared, near the old canal road. This was a detail the family had never known, and it reframed the entire timeline. With this new information, police returned to the neighborhood, examining areas that had long been overlooked. The drainage line, recently uncovered during municipal work, provided access to a previously inaccessible stretch of land. Forensic teams and structural engineers worked together, meticulously scanning for any sign of what might have occurred so long ago. Their patience and precision were rewarded when they uncovered a shallow pit, long collapsed and hidden beneath layers of soil, debris, and gravel. It was poorly filled, likely a remnant of abandoned construction from decades earlier, the kind of hazard easily overlooked, and yet deadly in its obscurity. Excavation of the pit was painstaking, each layer removed with care to preserve potential evidence. As the soil was cleared, investigators found fragments of human bone, delicate yet unmistakable. Among them lay an old wristwatch, corroded with age but frozen at a precise moment. 6:03 a.m., mere minutes after Kadir had left his home. Nearby, remnants of fabric were recovered, identified as consistent with the clothing he had worn that morning. The combination of these items confirmed a tragic, final truth. Kadir had never ventured beyond his neighborhood, had never been abducted and taken far from home. He had been trapped, hidden in plain sight, his fate sealed within moments of stepping out the door. The forensic team conducted lab analysis on every recovered fragment. Bones were tested, DNA confirmed identity, and fabric fibers were cross-referenced with his wardrobe. Each confirmation reinforced the story that had been pieced together from the diary and letters. Kadir had been lured to a specific location under circumstances that remained partly unknown and had fallen or perhaps been pushed into an unmarked construction sinkhole that had been improperly filled years earlier. The simplicity of the mechanism belied the tragedy. A man of routine and caution had been caught unaware by the very ground beneath his feet, his life extinguished so quietly that it remained invisible for 12 long years. The evidence left investigators grappling with questions that may never be fully answered. While the diary suggested the presence of coercion, hints of planning, and an impending meeting with an unknown party, the identity of a potential perpetrator could not be definitively proven. No eyewitnesses came forward, and no new suspects were identified through contemporary investigation. The circumstances suggested that Kadir had been drawn to the pit under false pretenses, perhaps by someone he trusted or by someone exploiting knowledge of his daily habits. Yet, the lack of conclusive proof meant the case would remain, in part, a haunting mystery. For the family, the revelation was a mixture of grief and relief. Years of unanswered questions, sleepless nights, and quiet suffering culminated in an understanding of what had truly occurred. The daughter who had kept his bed untouched, the wife who still left his sandals by the door, the children who had grown into adults under the shadow of uncertainty, all were finally able to reconcile the story of that morning with the evidence before them. There was heartbreak in learning the immediacy of his death, the tragic inevitability of a fall that had been waiting beneath the surface. Yet there was also comfort in knowing that Kadir had never wandered helplessly, never suffered prolonged disappearance, and had not been abandoned by fate alone. His final hours, brief though they were, had been contained, silent, and tragically ordinary. Authorities conducted a thorough survey of the site to ensure no additional hazards or evidence remained undiscovered. Engineers and forensic specialists documented the collapsed pit, mapping it precisely, photographing the recovered items, and creating a detailed report for both municipal records and the ongoing investigation. The site itself became an unsettling monument, a place that had remained hidden for years, bearing witness to a death that was quietly catastrophic in its simplicity. The investigators' work ensured that the tragedy would be preserved in record, its lessons learned, and the story told fully. The final forensic sweep offered additional insights. Soil samples indicated decades of gradual settlement, which explained why previous searches had failed to detect the pit. Its collapse and concealment were natural over time, making it virtually invisible to casual observation or routine inspection. This explained the years of uncertainty, the absence of a body, and the lack of immediate leads. It also reinforced the narrative emerging from the diary and letters. Qadir's disappearance had not been random. The environment, the timing, and the layout of the land had conspired to make a fatal accident nearly impossible to anticipate. As the family and investigators stood together at the site, there was a palpable silence. The revelation was both clarifying and chilling. Haji Abdul Qadir had walked out of his home that morning, as he did every morning, and in the space of minutes, he had vanished into the earth itself. For 12 years, the neighborhood had lived with the uncertainty of a man missing without trace. Now, the earth had given up its secret. The moment of his death was pinpointed not through speculation but through science and diligent investigation. The time, the location, and the recovered belongings painted a full, if tragic, picture of his final steps. Yet the human element remained complex. The diary had suggested anticipation of coercion. The photograph hinted at connections long forgotten, and the meeting planned for that morning raised questions that would likely remain unanswered. Qadir had been cautious, aware, and proactive in protecting himself and his property. And yet, fate, whether in the form of an unstable pit, misjudged terrain, or external manipulation, had intervened in a way no amount of foresight could prevent. The truth was simple, devastating, and irrevocable. He had died almost immediately after leaving home, hidden in plain sight, waiting for 12 years before being discovered. The psychological weight on the family was immense. Relief mingled with sorrow. The daughter, who had refused to let anyone touch her father's belongings, could now understand the reality of what had occurred. The wife could finally let go of the fear that he had been wandering, lost, or suffering somewhere unseen. And the children could reconcile the uncertainty that had shaped their adolescence and adulthood. Their grief remained, but it was anchored now in truth rather than speculation. They had closure, even if it came wrapped in the stark inevitability of his death. Investigators compiled the final report, noting every piece of evidence and every step of the investigation. The case was officially marked as solved, though the circumstances retained an air of haunting ambiguity. Who, if anyone, had lured him to the canal road? Had the fall been accidental or intentional? The answers could not be definitively established. Yet, in the cold clarity of forensic science, one truth remained undeniable. Haji Abdul Qadir had never left his familiar streets. The entire neighborhood, every intersection he had walked past, had been witness to a death that was invisible, tragic, and inexorably bound to the land itself. The story concluded not with the mystery of disappearance, but with the finality of mortality, framed against years of waiting, searching, and uncertainty. For 12 years, he had been a ghost in his own community, and the earth had held him in silence. Now, with the discovery of bones, the watch stopped at 6:03 a.m., and fragments of his clothing, the truth was undeniable. His routine, his life, and his death were all contained within the same neighborhood that had watched him leave, powerless to prevent the tragedy that followed. As night fell over the site, there was a profound stillness. The discovery had closed one chapter, yet the story remained resonant, a cautionary tale of routine, trust, and the fragility of life. Haji Abdul Qadir had walked his last morning path with dignity and discipline, unaware that the earth beneath him carried the quiet threat that would claim him. For the family, the neighborhood, and those who had followed the case, the revelation offered closure tempered with the haunting understanding that he had been waiting for 12 years, hidden in plain sight until the earth itself allowed the secret to surface. In the end, the disappearance was no longer a riddle. It was a record of a man who had lived cautiously, acted with foresight, and yet succumbed to the silent danger of a forgotten pit. The final piece, the shallow sinkhole, the bones, the watch connected the dots across a dozen years of anguish, speculation, and hope. And in that connection lay both heartbreak and solace, a truth that was devastating in its simplicity, yet undeniable, leaving the community, the investigators, and the family with a haunting final image of a man who had vanished not into the unknown, but into the earth itself, waiting 12 years for the world to finally know.